Just a little backstory. What I wanted to talk about, which I thought would be really interesting for people, because I know I've gotten shit about this and Paul has gotten shit about this, that to go through Paul's intellectual journey, right, which is probably a little more extreme than mine, because I lucked out and found what worked for me the first time out. Whereas, Paul has gotten a lot of from people for first going carnivore, being a doctor, and then for adding sugar back in. And I wanted to go through, the process, because I think there's just not enough of a track record to let people understand, just to go through the intellectual journey and to go through how you're not doing, how each one of the three of us really is doing this in response to evidence, even though it's causing problems, right? I mean, Josh is quitting his job because of this, and
Yeah.
Paul's gone rogue years ago.
It's taken me 5 years of research to get to where I'm at, but we are constantly learning and changing our views. That's what science is, as we better it,
Yeah.
Right. And I think that'll be really interesting for a lot of people and really helpful for people to say, oh, wow, these guys are going through the exact same thing that I'm going through.
Yeah, for sure. Let's do it.
Hi, this is Tucker Goodrich. I am here with two physicians today, Paul Saladino and Josh Durham, who's a family doctor out of Boise, Idaho. And what I wanted to get into today is the intellectual journey, mainly Paul, because he's been a public figure for a lot longer, but all three of us have gone through this process. The intellectual journey that has led each of us to change our views on nutrition and to adopt whatever position it is right now. And it doesn't matter if we have some differences between the three of us. We can get into discussing what those might be and how we arrived at those conclusions. But Paul, can you introduce yourself and give us a little idea of what your medical education was?
Yeah. So I grew up in a medical household. My dad is an internist. My mom's a nurse practitioner. I was sort of fascinated by why humans get sick from an early age. And I mean, even when I was a kid, I was trying to do experiments on myself and figure out what was causing problems, or just trying to be healthy, what I believed was healthy. Now, along the way, I've made a lot of mistakes, which is part of the interesting part of this conversation. I think the first set of those mistakes was when I was a kid. I was just trying to do the low fat because I didn't really understand nutrition. I didn't really understand biochemistry. I certainly didn't really understand fat. And all I knew was that I was 13 or 14 years old and fat was in the arteries. And so fat caused problems. So I just ate like cereal and milk every day when I got home from school. And I got really low fat when I was a young kid. That may or may not have influenced my health at that age. Fast forward, eventually I took a bunch of time off after college, which was kind of my own personal journey. I did a lot of gallivanting, some ski bumming, some mountain biking, just exploring. I threw hiked the Pacific Crest Trail. That probably affected the way that I see the world, and contributed to my, I think, like disobedience in general. First, I was a physician assistant in cardiology. I went to George Washington University to get my PA, my master's, to become a PA. Quickly, as a PA in cardiology, I got frustrated with that position, without autonomy, and suddenly being in medicine, realized that most of what I was seeing around me, being in a cardiology practice with very intelligent and well-intentioned doctors, was just treatment of symptoms with medications that invariably had side effects that seemed to me as a practitioner to be underreported and underemphasized. And so I went back to medical school at the University of Arizona, and the whole intention there was to become some sort of a integrative / root cause practitioner. There's no good word for this these days. I didn't want to practice pharmaceutical-based medicine to the extent that it's practiced within allopathic medicine today. I wanted to do something to address the root cause. So my curiosity in medicine began as I was leaving my world as a PA in cardiology and moving to medical school at the University of Arizona. I went there because, well, it was in state, because I was working in Flagstaff as a PA, and also because they had a Center for Integrative Medicine. I didn't really end up getting a lot from Andrew Weil's ideas about integrative medicine, but that's a different story. Then I did residency at the University of Washington in Seattle. My residency was in psychiatry, because at the end of my medical school, or toward the end of medical school, I thought that I just kind of got a little disillusioned with medicine. I really like internal medicine, but I just didn't like. I like human stories, and I like what makes people tick. I like behaviors, and I kind of felt like psychiatry felt very human to me. And I got really interested eventually in neuroinflammation and connections with diet and nutrients, and began to realize that it's all connected. And a lot of the things that are causing psychiatric disease are the same things that are causing
Right.
disease and everything else. There's really, I think specialties are kind of a construct that doesn't serve patients. But my residency was in psychiatry, mental health, just, I don't know, it was interesting to me at the time. And then after my residency, during the end of my residency, I had my own sort of health issues come up, pretty bad eczema that forced me to go even deeper into the dietary world. I'd been eating a healthy diet for many years at that point, mostly organic, paleo type things, a mix of everything, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, meat, and still had pretty bad eczema. So I felt there was something else. That was the beginning of the carnivore experiments and thinking about which foods that we think of as healthy that might not be so healthy for all people or might be triggering autoimmunity. So that's an interesting journey down the realm of plant foods and which are good and which might be problematic for some people. And I've certainly shifted my views in that plant world over time. So after residency, I did a board certification as a physician nutrition specialist, mostly just to shut up the haters, because anytime you try and talk about nutrition as a quote psychiatrist who never really practiced psychiatry and is mostly just reading articles and curious as a doctor, people try and discredit you because they think that what does a psychiatrist know about nutrition? Well, what does any doctor know about nutrition? Because it's not taught in any residency ever. We're all pretty much self-taught. And I remember, I mean, this is an interesting anecdote, and then I'll stop rambling, but I went on the Doctor's TV show, which is incredible because it's generated so much good content for me, even 3 to 4 years later with the way that they attacked me. But on that show, there was a physician and internist who loved to tout the fact that she was a board certified physician nutrition specialist and used that to essentially make my credentials inferior to hers. So just the idea that like it's hard. I mean, Tucker, you can speak to this as well, but it's hard to even speak like as a physician who passed all the boards. I did really well on my boards. I studied for years. I spent hours and hours in the hospital, rotating through every specialty imaginable. People still don't believe that I have the platform or the ability to talk about anything nutrition, and so it's crazy. And so, but again, we're all self-taught. Since then, since graduating residency in 2019. I have definitely shifted. I wrote a book about the carnivore diet and then pretty quickly added fruit and honey to my diet in a humbling left-hand turn, which has been an interesting experiment. And I still continue to eat plant foods in the form of fruit. So things like squash, fruit juice, and honey.
Okay, well, let's not jump to the meat of the podcast just yet.
Oh, okay, all right. That's my journey.
Yeah, that's okay. That's good. So Josh, it sounds like the takeaway for this is that if you want to be a good, happy little doctor, don't do something interesting in between graduating from college and going to medical school, because Josh has a similar story to yours in that respect. Josh, you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah. So I grew up in Idaho, and I did not have any doctors in the family, but I loved my pediatrician as a kid. So I always said, I'm going to be a doctor. And I got my bachelor's degree in biology and then went to osteopathic medical school in Kansas City. And
which school was that?
At the time it was, well, they changed the name now. It's Kansas City University of Medicine and Biosciences.
Okay.
And so I did my 4 years there and decided I wanted to do family practice because I felt like in general practice, you kind of had to know something about everything. And I liked that. Initially, I'd wanted to do orthopedics because I was a sports junkie. I did amateur boxing with USA, amateur boxing for like 12 years. And I really enjoyed that. And so when I got into medical school, though, I loved the family practice side of it. I loved being able to see adults and kids and just kind of have to know something about everything. And so I stayed in Kansas City and did 3 years of family practice residency. And then when I graduated there, I went to a rural town in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and practiced for about 4.5 years. And then eventually made my way back home. Though interestingly, throughout residency and stuff, I did continue to box and compete. And so I was always into working out and being in shape. And about the age of 29, I quit doing that, which was probably a good thing. But when I got to Boise, I started working here, and I was just doing, the standard medical school clinic, prescribing medications and patting myself on the back and feeling like I'm doing a good job. And about 5 years ago, it was like I just woke up one day and all of a sudden I was fat. I weighed 238 pounds. I couldn't get out of bed. I did my labs. I had high blood pressure. I needed pills for cholesterol. I was pre-diabetic. And I was still running 7 miles a day, 6 days a week. Like, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't lose weight, and I was eating what we were told you should be eating, And
one quick interjection here.
Yeah.
How much nutrition did the two of you have in medical school? You,
Like-
Paul, did a certification after, but actually in medical school, how much
yeah.
nutrition?
1 or 2 lectures, probably. I mean, you just don't really get nutrition lectures.
Okay, so what, like 8-10 hours? How many hours are we talking for a lecture?
Oh, no.
No, I literally 1 or 2 lectures, like an hour each. It's
Okay.
it's yeah.
And so in practice, if somebody needs nutrition advice, you farm them out to a registered
Yeah, I just farmed to
dietitian
to a standard dietitian. Yeah.
right.
So I kind of had this moment where I was like looking in the mirror and saying, okay, something's wrong. And if I need 4 pills, whatever method of my practice I'm doing is not working. And so that's when I kind of went on this journey to start researching and watching podcasts and learning. I would see somebody say, oh, you can reverse diabetes. And so I would turn around and watch that podcast. And it eventually led me into doing what I call now dirty keto. And I lost, 20, 25 pounds through that. But eventually I tried doing Paul's carnivore diet for about 3.5 months, which his old school carnivore diet. And that was actually really good. And was probably one of the best times I'd felt. I got a little bit sick, and we can talk more about this later, but I got to a point where I was doing like the standard keto where you're eating too much fat and not enough protein. And I was still working out, and I actually lost a lot of muscle mass and got kind of sickly. So then that kind of led me to like the Ted Naiman version where you eat more protein. But anyway, it led to me also doing trying the standard carnivore. And during that carnivore time was when I couldn't believe how much better I felt. And so I started wondering, like, why do I feel so much better on carnivore than I did on keto? And that's when I learned about the seed oils. And so what I call dirty keto is dirty keto with all the seed oils, the ranch and the blue cheese, the mayo. And so I've had to evolve over the last 5 years trying to figure out the best advice to give my patients and myself. And I think I've got it pretty well figured out, but it's still, it's a lot of research and a lot of
trial and error.
Yeah. And so,
Okay.
I've had to eat crow with a lot of patients on some things and be like, yeah, the way we did this at the beginning probably wasn't the smartest, but it's been a good journey.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Paul, so how did you become your Twitter iteration of the Carnivore MD before you rebranded yourself to be just Dr. Paul Saladino?
Well, I think that I got interested in carnivore, right? So again, go back to medical school and residency. So medical school, University of Arizona, I had eczema pretty badly a few times. I was doing a lot of jujitsu at the time, and I would get impetigo. I would get skin infections from the eczema. And I didn't really understand what was causing it. I was eating everything but organic paleo type diet. And then in residency, it just got frustrating for me. I think that probably the biggest flare I had in residency was caused by like mushroom extracts. I was taking a bunch of mushroom extracts at like reishi and lion's mane and chaga and probably a few others, but I was taking some pretty big doses of those. And I had massive eczema flare, massive, that lasted weeks. And I just got super frustrated. I thought, okay, I'm doing something wrong. And
what was the idea behind the mushroom extracts?
Just that, I think I had friends that were interested in mushroom extracts, and I hadn't really been down the rabbit hole in the data. But if you listen to, so this is an interesting point. If you listen to the zeitgeist, if you listen to what most people are saying about something, I think you can often be misled. It's challenging, right? Because if you listen to the mainstream, quote mainstream, if you listen to the majority, or let's just say that the tidal flow of health advice, you might not eat seed oils anymore, but you might take mushroom extracts because lion's mane is in vogue. And so is cold plunging and sauna. And so I think that I was doing something that was en vogue in the health space, and mushroom extracts were supposed to be in vogue. I like experimenting, and I thought, oh, maybe I can feel even better by doing these mushroom extracts. And I had a friend that was connected. I had a friend that was connected with a grower who grew them in a special way. And so I was like, yeah, I was just doing mushroom extracts to feel better. I mean, I'm in residency in Seattle. I'm
what
basically
could go wrong?
well, I'm basically sort of like, I'm in a miserable time in my life, not really excited about where I'm at, or also just not really loving mainstream medicine and counting the days until I can do my own thing more fully. And so, yeah. And so I had a big eczema flare, and I thought about this carnivore diet. I actually heard Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan's podcast one day as I was driving to the coast. I remember I was driving to the Washington coast to go surfing. So I'm probably driving through 45-degree rain, thinking about putting on my 5 mil wetsuit to go in the ocean and swim with some sharks. And I'm listening to a podcast. I probably was going to camp in my truck also, because I was in residency and I can't actually afford a hotel. And so I was going to do that. And I hear Jordan Peterson at the end of this podcast with Joe Rogan talk about all these biblical things, and then talk about his autoimmune disease and how going carnivore and getting rid of all plant products really improved his autoimmune disease. And I thought, that is really interesting. And I haven't heard anyone talk about it significantly. And I haven't heard anyone really look at the science there. And I'd never really heard the concept that vegetables or plant foods in general might not be great for all humans, or this idea of defense chemicals completely foreign to me. And so that was where the journey began with carnivore to fix the eczema. And so in the short term, I went back from surfing and bought a ton of steaks and tallow and liver and salt. And that was all I ate for a while. And the eczema got better, but there's more to the story.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember the first time I heard about carnivore. I'm a big history fan, so I'd read, Farley Moat read a book called The People of the Deer, where he talked about this carnivorous Eskimo tribe, and who didn't live on the ocean. They lived inland, and all they ate was caribou effectively, and then blueberries and mice in the summer. And but I was never, when I because of that, I never really found it all that shocking the way some people seem to. I was like, yeah, okay, well, some people eat like that. That's reasonable. I don't understand the reaction that a lot of so-called nutritional professionals have when they are like, oh, you're going to get scurvy. Now that I've done my homework, well, they disproved that, carnivore causes scurvy in the 1920s, I think. So,
And if you listen to, if you listen to mainstream nutrition and dietetics, you'll also get vitamin K deficient, Tucker, even though you're eating massive amounts of menaquinones and vitamin K2 in liver, which apparently they don't teach people about in dietetics school. Because when I went on the doctor's TV show, they said there's no vitamin C on a carnivore diet and there's no vitamin K.
Wrong.
And it was just like, I was like, wait, what? Anyway, so yeah.
And what's interesting is vitamin K2 is what your body actually needs. Your body converts, just like beta carotene and vitamin A, which is actually retinol. Retinol, the best source of it is animal foods, liver, right? Vitamin K2, the best source of it is animal foods, liver. And both of those, beta carotene and vitamin K, what you find in plants, have to be converted in the body. And people do varying degrees of well with converting them so that they get enough to meet their needs. You would.
And there's a huge study, the Rotterdam study looking at, it's just epidemiology, but it's pretty compelling epidemiology with calcific aortic stenosis and cardiovascular disease outcomes, showing that, the upper tertile, the people who get the most vitamin K2 in their diet, which they're not getting from plants. Nobody in Rotterdam is eating natto, fermented soybeans. The only source of plant vitamin K2 is bacteria in natto. So they're getting this from animal foods. They have the lowest rates of calcific aortic sclerosis and cardiovascular disease. And yet, Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health gets wrapped around the axle every 6 months about how red meat and animal foods full of vitamin K2, which pretty clearly, according to the data, is associated with lower cardiovascular outcomes. But Harvard, Walter Willett and these guys, Frank Hugh, get all up in arms and say, well, red meat causes diabetes. Just came out, Tucker. I don't know if you know this, October 19th, and red meat causes cardiovascular disease. I'm sure you've dealt with this too, Josh.
Yeah.
Well, and the interesting thing is I went through all the research on this a long time ago, and I forget exactly why, but then when my father was in his last couple of years, he basically died of calcification, right? He got critical limb ischemia. He had to have they basically stuck a roto-rooter down his femoral artery to clean out all the calcification. They put 8 stents in his leg, right? Shortly before he died, one of his valves in his heart had cemented itself shut. There are these 3 little things. 2 of them were stuck together and couldn't work properly because of the calcification. And I went to his doctor, his doctor and his cardiologist. And I said, you've got him on 2 medications that cause calcification. He was on warfarin for a blood thinner because he had atrial fibrillation. And he was on statins because everybody should be on statins, both of which cause calcification. And what blew my mind, neither of the doctors knew that. The cardiologist didn't even know that, right? And I started asking him, have you thought about giving him vitamin K2 supplements? And they're like, oh, we can't give him vitamin K on warfarin. I was like, no, K2. And the difference for the audience between vitamin K and vitamin K2, most significantly, is that vitamin K2 has been shown to reverse calcification in rodents. So it just, the lack, first off, the lack of awareness, as I think, Paul, you said, that they don't realize how common these side effects are. In this case, they didn't even realize it was a side effect for either one of these 2 drugs. And neither one of them had any idea that it's treatable. How treatable is something we can get into. They've done an RCT on it, but the RCT didn't do anything about changing diet, just gave some K2 supplements. But it just astonished me that I was, of the 3, I was the only one who knew this stuff.
Josh, how much warfarin do you see given in your practice today? Is it mostly direct thrombin inhibitors, or is it still warfarin?
Most people have moved into the newer agents. Unless,
right.
Like I have a sister who has a protein S deficiency, so she's got to take warfarin. But most people are moving to those newer ones, I would say.
So, yeah, it's just interesting to me. I mean,
yeah,
warfarin,
they did, by the way, move him to Eliquis, one of the newer drugs.
Yeah.
After he had three, apparently warfarin stops working after a while, and he had 3 major strokes. So they were like, okay, this game's over. Let's move into something else.
And just so everyone listening knows, warfarin is rat poison. So
literally rat poison.
Yeah, it's literally rat poison.
Literally.
It's literally rat poison. This is Western medicine gives people rat poison and says, oh, no big deal. Like, what do you need? And it interferes with vitamin K carboxylation. So you can't make vitamin K. You really can't absorb it. You can't make it. And people on warfarin can't eat vitamin K in foods. So they're instructed, don't eat vitamin K1 in plant foods. I don't think many people are eating, much liver. So they're not getting vitamin K2, but even eggs, vitamin K2. So they're basically told, develop a vitamin K deficiency. What could go wrong long-term? Well, we're going to thin your blood because there are vitamin K dependent clotting factors. But this is the problem with Western medicine. Like, oh, what could go wrong if we just make you vitamin K deficient? Because what do you need vitamin K for?
He was on warfarin for 20. He'd been on it for 25 years at that point, right? It's time for a lot of calcification, and
it's crazy. It's crazy, and this is what happens. And you mentioned statins, Tucker, so we could mention that as well. Like, I think that I've had John Abrams on my podcast and talked about statins and the apparent corruption in that industry with pharmaceuticals, and the Royal College in London that basically holds all of the data for statins that will not release it to the public.
Dr. Rory Collins, yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes, we won't let you see the original data on the side effects from the statin trials because the people who hold it don't want you to see it.
It sounds like something else.
That's encouraging. That builds confidence.
Just
trust us.
What else do we know about recently that we can't mention on any of these podcasts for fear of getting censored that had a similar thing where we actually couldn't see the real data? We can't say it.
Yeah, exactly.
The interventions that shall not be named. Yeah, so there's no corruption. And in my practice, like I mentioned, as a cardiology PA, the apparent side effects from statins were 20-30% of people got myalgias, muscle aches. People had forgetfulness, they had brain fog, they had libido problems. And so I think that the statin, probably the side effects were 30-40%. If you look at the trials, and I think you and I have talked about this on previous podcasts, Tucker, so we don't need to belabor it. They have this run-in period where a lot of the statin trials, anyone who gets side effects is excluded from the trial. So that Lipitor, a drug, atorvastatin, I am embarrassed to say, and I've said this in the past, that I actually did speaking engagements for atorvastatin when I was a PA. I was like, brush my shoulders off. Here I am, I'm a cool PA. I can give a talk on atorvastatin with all the Pfizer approved slides. Look, guys, I was a Pfizer lackey too. I admit it. I'll take the tomatoes.
But, Josh has got an interesting story about LP little a inhibitors. And I think that guy was also a PA working for.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
There was a PA guy that invited me to a dinner. He prided himself on being a lipidologist, and he knows a lot of stuff, but basically what I felt like is the way they're painting the picture is LP little a is going to be the next bad guy, so they can come out with a drug to lower LP little a. And
just for the audience, LP little a is essentially a type of LDL with an extra protein on it. That's the LP little a. And it's thought, well, we won't get into what they think it does right yet, but what was that? Which company was that?
I can't remember the name of the company, but
starts with an A.
They're doing current studies on an LPA inhibitor. Yeah. So I just feel like that's probably what the next thing is going to be coming down in the pipeline.
Right. And it's ironic because for years, there's a Dr. Sam Semikis, who I follow closely because of what LP little a does. And he's been kind of saying, okay, this is more important than LDL. And all the doctors are like, no, LDL is all that matters. And now all of a sudden they're going to pivot 180 degrees.
And what's interesting is
take this drug for LP little a.
Yeah, and what's interesting, if you look, like the statins increase LP little a,
right?
And so it's kind of baffling, and that's part of my journey over the last 5 years. Is I realized I just kind of did algorithm cookie cutter medicine, and I wasn't really thinking. But now I look at the LDL molecule and I think, okay, what is that thing's job? We didn't evolve with this molecule to just kill us from day one, and so
no. That's the LDL's job is to kill you.
Yeah,
have it on good authority.
I've spent a lot of time researching, like, what is LDL? What's in LDL? What is its job? What is its function? And that's where I've come to learn how you can adjust the glycosylation or oxidation of LDL depending on your diet and your nutrition. And there's small studies that show you can adjust your LP little a level based on some of the stuff too. And so I actually try to educate my patients on this, and I've got a lot of patients that let me do this advanced lipid testing, and we're following right now, seeing, are we going to be able to drop that LP little a? And so it's interesting stuff that I'm trying to keep track of. It's fascinating.
Okay, well, without getting too far afield, so Paul, you got super gung-ho on the carnivore topic. And I certainly think, I think if you had to rank diets, carnivore would be a contender for the most optimal human diet. I've said, I said that years ago, back when Sean Baker was just starting to come out into the community. But tell us about why you're no longer the Carnivore MD.
Yeah, carnivore definitely helps people. I've met a lot of people that have found benefits in a carnivore diet, and I found benefits in a carnivore diet. Most people I meet who say they found benefits from a strict carnivore diet, and there's probably some confirmation bias here, but they also tell me now that they eat some other things. So
they cheat.
Well, quote, not really. They don't really cheat. They call it, I think of it as animal based, and we can frame that. But they ended up, I think of carnivore. This is a little bit ahead of myself, but I think of carnivore now as a really good elimination diet. Here's a simple diet of very nutrient rich food that we can pretty confidently say is going to not lead to any nutrient deficiencies. We can't say this about a vegan diet. If you just ate potatoes, which people have done, I think you're going to get nutrient deficient. But if you just eat meat and organs, especially liver, you can go for a pretty long time without developing nutrient deficiencies. There are some things you may not have optimal. You'd have to eat a lot of liver to get maybe what we believe is an optimal amount of vitamin C, but you won't get scurvy.
Right.
And regardless, for me, about a year and a half into strict carnivore, I moved to San Diego after residency, and I'm actually in the process. This is humble pie, Tucker. I'm writing my book. I'm writing the Carnivore Code. Super interesting. And to be fully transparent, I never thought I could write a book. I didn't think I had it in me, but once I started writing, it was so interesting. And I never thought of myself as a good writer. I don't really think I am a good writer, but I enjoyed writing the book. I think a lot of people found it too technical, but I really loved connecting the dots and diving into each of those things. So I'm writing this book that I never thought I could write, having found benefits, having heard many stories at this point of people finding benefits, thinking there's something here, but then also beginning to really come to terms with the fact that for me, eating strictly meat and organs and fat and salt, that was all I ate, wasn't optimal. And I was having sleep disturbance. I was having tachycardia at night. Even back in Seattle, I had hypnagogic jerks, which is basically as you're falling asleep, you jerk yourself awake. So hypnagogic means you're going to sleep, and it's very maddening. It like drives someone a little crazy.
I've had those my whole life.
Yeah.
I can't blame that on a carnivore diet.
Yeah, I think it's related to electrolyte deficiency.
Could be. That's interesting.
Yeah. And so I would have them badly, meaning that I would have one and then another and then another. And once you have two or three of these, as you're going to sleep, your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight nervous system gets so activated that you can't sleep for hours. And I'm not talking about like little twitches, because I still get little twitches. If I'm laying next to someone in my bed taking a nap, my girlfriend or whatever, and I fall asleep, she might say, "Oh, your leg twitched." No, this is where your whole body goes, whoa, and you just jerk yourself awake.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
it's not just a little
extreme.
twitch. This is jerking yourself awake. You feel like you're falling, and you wake up like, wow, it wakes you up, as opposed to just little twitches, which is your nervous system as you're going to sleep. And so, if I looked at my testosterone previous to carnivore, 800 total. A year and a half into carnivore, it's like 500. So it's declining. Sex hormone binding globulin is going up. Having muscle cramps when I go to the gym to do any sort of like rock climbing or anything, muscle cramps when I'm surfing. And I'm always a little bit cold. There's lots of ways to look at thyroid labs, but really my free T3 was just not good, too low. And my TSH though within range. So I had some thyroid abnormalities, SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin going up. Anyway, lab abnormalities, sleep disturbance, muscle cramps, chronically feeling cold. And I kind of had to think like, okay, I don't think this long-term carnivore diet is working for me as I'm writing a book about carnivore that I think is going to help people. So at that point, I began to think like, what are the least toxic sources of carbohydrates I could incorporate back into my diet?
Okay. So now, there are guys, I'll note that there are no human populations that are totally carnivore, meaning that they don't eat any vegetable matter, at least seasonally. The Eskimo, the Sami people in Scandinavia, they may be carnivore all winter because they don't have a choice, but when berries are out there, they will eat berries, right? Wolves, I just found a study really recently, wolves will eat berries, blueberries.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently up to like 80% of their diet at certain times of the year, which is kind of surprising. So yeah, it's not. On the other hand, there are guys like Sean Baker, seems to be a paragon of health on a total carnivore diet, and he's been doing it for what now, 5-6 years?
Yeah, I don't follow Sean. I'll just interject this briefly, Tucker. I don't follow Sean too closely, but he posted something on YouTube recently that he was changing his macros because he was having some, like, I think disc issues in his neck or something. I don't know what was going on, but
he got hurt. He got injured doing, I think it was Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was wondering if going for a more ketogenic carnivore diet, you know, cutting back on the protein, upping the fat would help with the inflammation he was
Interesting.
experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's a tweak, not a, not a repudiation or a
Yeah. Yeah.
abandonment of it.
And I'll just add this. I'm sorry to keep interrupting you. If you look at Sean's labs, and look, I would love to have Sean back on my podcast. I recently had Anthony Chapey on my podcast. Great guy. I really like having people on my podcast that I don't fully agree with. And Anthony and I had a great conversation about like where we disagree. We talked about fruit, we talked about organs. I would love to have Sean back on my podcast. Maybe he'll do it. But, and Sean has not shared his blood work in quite a while that I'm aware of. Maybe he has. The last set of blood work that I've seen from Sean was many years ago. And his labs did not look good. So I'll just say that. Like, okay. I would gently disagree with the fact that like, I would not want Sean Baker's labs. His hemoglobin A1C was 6.1. His testosterone was, I think, less than 300 total. I don't think I saw a thyroid. I don't know if I saw a fasting insulin either, but just in terms of fasting blood glucose was 106, I think. So there's some stuff there that we could talk about if we want, but right. Yeah, I think that Sean is able to do things with weights. He's a large human, clearly got Viking DNA or some kind of, huge human DNA. But
I've met, I mean, I'm 5'8". I've met Sean and stood next to him, and he is huge.
He's a big human. Yeah,
he's a freak. He's not a freak in a bad way. I mean, everybody wishes they look like Thor.
Yeah. Sean is like a bald Thor in the best way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, okay. So right. So fine. So how did this experience of starting to question the carnivore, what was the timing with your trip to Africa to visit the tribe that you saw there?
The Hadza. So
the Hadza, thank you. Right.
Yeah. So I think I started eating carbohydrates again. End of 2019, early 2020. Yeah. So I was eating carbohydrates for probably a year plus before I went to see the Hadza, which was in 2021.
Okay.
And yeah. So that was, and first the carbohydrates were honey and then fruit, and the fruit in the United States. Now that I live in Costa Rica, I realize the fruit in the United States is kind of a joke, but we can talk about different fruit sources. But look, and we don't have to get into fructose if you don't want to, but we can. When I was writing the Carnivore Code, I was looking at data that looks like fructose was harmful for humans. So I was concerned about fruit. And so one of my evolutions was digging more into the data on fruit, fructose, and some nuance there. So again, it's like, this is complicated stuff. There's a lot of nuance. The deeper I go in the data on anything, the more nuance I see, whether it's seed oils, right, whether it's polyunsaturated fats, which are different than seed oils necessarily, whether it's fructose, whether it's fruit, like it's complex. There's a lot of nuance. And I've spoken about fruit and fructose many times in my podcast, but yeah, so I'd been eating it carbs for about a year before I went to see the Hadza. So when one of the tribe members goes up in a tree after he started fire from nothing, no matches, within 90 seconds, right, and smokes out the bees and hands me a piece of hive with like larvae in it, and I just take a big bite. I wasn't phased because I've been eating honey.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And people don't, I've heard people say, oh, well, we couldn't have been eating honey for very long because whatever reason. And we've had fire for, a couple 100,000 years. I forget exactly. I think it's like 400,000 or 1 million years. And what's also interesting is that there are stingless bees in Africa that do make honey. So you can get honey, you can acquire the taste without getting stung potentially. I
ate that honey when I was in Africa. So yeah. And I have stingless bees here in Costa Rica. At my house, I have a hive. But I had that stingless bee honey in Africa. Excuse me. I was with the Hadza with a baobab tree. The ones I have here are mariola. I don't know if it's the same species in Africa, but they make this little tube. It's like a little wax straw that goes into the tree, and that's all you see. And the Hadza tribesmen see this, and they go with their axe, and they basically wreck shop and really, really give the mariola bees a bad day, but they get honey out of it. And then I think the bees just go somewhere else and make another hive.
Right. Okay, interesting. That's really neat. So what did for folks who don't, now the Hadza are one of the oldest, well, I guess we're all equally old at the end of the day, if you want to look at it that way. But they live in one of the oldest styles of living. They're hunter-gatherers. They still live in the African bush. They haven't adopted really any sort of agriculture, but
Zero.
they are masters of going out and finding stuff to eat in an environment that would probably cause most of us to starve to death if we tried to replicate what they're doing. Talk about what they're eating.
Yeah, they're pretty incredible. So they're not perfect. I often liken this to like a DeLorean, a time machine. The Hadza are probably the best 50,000-year-old, going back 50,000 years in the DeLorean experiment that we have. Right. They're not perfect. They drink alcohol, they smoke marijuana, they smoke cigarettes, but they're minimalists. They don't keep anything. They don't build homes that are stable. They're essentially nomadic. They have a few camps they rotate to at different times of the year based on water supplies and animals they're hunting. They don't hunt they don't gather. Well, what am I saying? They don't farm anything. They only hunt and gather.
Right.
Recently, missionaries have been bringing them cornmeal and incidentally seed oils, ironically. So they will eat cornmeal, which was disappointing to see. But the reason that they need this cornmeal as a supplement appears to be the fact that there are other tribes in Africa, the Datoga or the Maasai, interestingly, that are pastoralists and are sort of encroaching on the Hadza's hunting lands. So what we learn about this is that in order to really be a true hunter-gatherer culture, a tribe of 50 to 100 people needs a lot of land. You need a lot of space to actually have healthy populations of animals that you can hunt. And this is the way humans lived for hundreds of thousands of years, clearly. There's a place in Africa called the Ngoro Crater, Ngoro. I think I'm spelling it right. And if you go to Tanzania, that's one of the coolest places I've ever been in my life. It's the closest thing I've ever seen to a Garden of Eden. I'm not necessarily getting biblical, nor am I really even religious, but if there were a Garden of Eden, that would be it. I think it's like 20 kilometers in diameter, and it's a 2,000 meter high rim of this volcano. So basically you have this Jurassic Park, and it's really what it is. I mean, you drive around in the Ngoro crater, and you see everything. There's lions, there's elephants, there's hippopotami, there's rhinoceri, there's jackals, there's water buffalo, there's giraffes, it's freaking Lion King, man. It's crazy.
And it's dense. It's not like you see one a day. They're everywhere, from my understanding.
No, they're everywhere. They're everywhere. It's Jurassic Park. They're everywhere. You can't not see it. It's just, it's everywhere. Like,
and I mean, the idea is that was what Africa looked like before it got hunted out by humans.
Probably something like that. Different parts had different, amounts of water, whether you're in a desert or whatever. But these game preserves are incredible. It's just, wow. And if you're a human living in the Ngoro crater, you better hope that you have some fire to keep away the lions. But if you want to go eat, you just walk out of your hut that you've made and you just go throw a spear at something, because it's going to walk right by your hut. It's crazy. I mean, you can go get an elephant, you can hunt a giraffe, you can hunt a water buffalo, you can hunt a jackal. It's everywhere. Where the Hadza live, which is in a place called Lake Eyasi, it's not like that at all. It's, we walked for hours to get to a place kind of up in the mountains a little bit where the baboons live, because that's mostly what they hunt now. They might see an eland, which is like a large gazelle, and that's their favorite game, but that's really rare that an eland comes into their hunting grounds. Mostly they're hunting small animals. I saw them get a genet cat, which is like the size of a house cat. I saw them get a dik-dik, which is like a really tiny deer, maybe a 20, 30 pound deer. They had little monkeys, and they got a big baboon. The baboon was the biggest thing they got while we were there. So we hunted baboons. We had to walk 5 or 6 hours. No, that's not true. Maybe 3 to 4 hours to get to the place where the baboons were. And then we had to hunt the baboons. Then we had to walk back to, from where the baboons were. And it's not easy, but believe me, they get the baboons, they celebrate, they eat the organs right away. And as we were eating the baboons, they were smoking these bees out, handing me a hive of honey with the larva in it. So they mostly, I never saw them eat a vegetable. That's not true. I never saw them eat a leaf or a seed or a stem They did eat roots, but they weren't super excited about it. And the Hadza are known to eat roots, but Frank
Well,
Marlowe.
chimpanzees eat roots. They'll dig up and eat roots. So
Maybe,
that's something
yeah.
that goes back very, very, very far in human evolution.
Yeah. And you can look at the amylase gene persistence as well, which would signal some carbohydrates.
Right.
So when we were doing roots, it's mostly the women who do the roots, and the guys were around, but they didn't really want to eat it. The guys just wanted to eat meat. They like honey and meat. And anthropologists have gone in and studied the Hadza and ranked their foods. And they, the men rank, I think meat as their favorite food. The women rank honey. No, that's not true. Men and women both rank honey as their favorite food. Men like meat second, and then berries, and then baobab. The women like, I think, something else before the meat, like baobab, and then the meat. But of the main 5 foods the Hadza eat are honey, meat with organs, berries. The baobab gets its own like category because it's a separate fruit, and then tubers. And both the men and the women rank tubers as their least favorite food. So they're like, okay, we'll eat it, but we're not excited. Nowhere on that list is salad. And they never ate a leaf while I was there. They never ate seeds. The only time that they ate anything that sort of resembled like a bitter vegetable was when the guy I was there with, part of the group that we were exploring with, my friend Anthony Gustin, had like intestinal pain. They gave him a root, probably with some sort of anti-helminthic something in it. So they used plant foods as medicine, but they weren't like gathering leaves anywhere.
Right.
And they're definitely not gathering seeds. Every plant they ate, they spit out the seeds. In fact, you had to spit out the seeds of a lot of the berries or you'd get really sick.
Yeah, you mentioned that one of them, you were popping them in and swallowing them, and they were like, no, don't do that.
And then Anthony and I both got super sick.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So then so now you had a pretty good piece of evidence that it's worth noting the Hadza are not perfectly healthy. They're small of stature. They have some dental issues, which one could attribute to the sugar intake, honey being
Probably the
sugar.
Tobacco more than the sugar, honestly.
Could be.
Yeah,
Certainly,
there's a lot of debate about
not
that.
helping their dental health. That's for sure.
There's debate about that. Sean Baker would love to say that the Hadza are getting their dental issues from the honey, and I would push back on that a little bit because
Right. Okay. But I mean, there's pretty good evidence that sugar, the marker that dentists use for dental decay is sucrase in the saliva, because that means you have sugar digesting bacteria in your mouth, and that's what causes cavity progression. So it definitely plays a factor. It's not, but that said, I mean, I just want to my own health journey. When I was a kid, I had so many cavities. I don't even know how many fillings I have in my mouth, and 8 teeth pulled. And when I was 18 years old, maybe almost 19 years old, the dentist I was seeing at the time said, well, if you're sick of getting cavities, you should stop eating sugar. And I was like, really? And I mean, as a kid, I used to eat table sugar by the tablespoon, right? I didn't have a cavity for almost 30 years after I cut sugar out of my diet. Natural sugar I would keep eating, right? I ate berries, I ate jelly, but I just wouldn't get anything with the added sugar. And then what was interesting when I started learning about nutrition and read Weston Price, he had a cavity healing diet, and he fed them a lot more sugar than I was eating at the time, right? But it was the rest of the diet that was preventing them from getting cavities, right? It was vitamin K2 he's credited with being the guy who discovered that as a factor that is able to calcify your teeth and your bones, where you want calcification, right? So anyway,
that's the point. If I can just add that, Tucker, I think that I'm not a dentist, but I've spoken to a number of biologic dentists who agree with this perspective, and I've vetted it with them. Like, if you really look, the teeth have an immune system. There are odontoblasts, like teeth are alive. It's very interesting. And vitamin K2, these fat soluble vitamins, are essential for a healthy immune system in the body, but also a healthy immune system in your teeth. So it's interesting for me because the sucrase thing, this is kind of an overarching theme. It's like, if the whole population is unhealthy, then yeah, you might see, if the whole population in this case is deficient in vitamin K2, then yeah, if you eat more sugar, you might get more tooth decay. But I'm not convinced that sugar actually leads to tooth decay in someone that is getting enough fat soluble vitamins in their diet. And to me, that's the really interesting piece.
Yeah.
We see this sort of contextual idea with LDL, with so many things that, like, yes, there are markers for problems in humans, and how healthy is the general population. So if you remove sugar,
to that point, I worked when I was still on Wall Street. We had a trainer in our company, Tete Tiwa. I'll call him out because he's still working in New York City, and he's Ghanaian. He's from Ghana in Africa. And when I mentioned to him sugar causing cavities, he said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I've never had a cavity in my life." And he smiled, and he has big, white, perfect teeth. And he said, "And we grew up eating sugarcane all the time," right? Interestingly, his mother, who lived in New York, was very diabetic, except whenever she went back to Ghana. And when she started eating the Ghanaian diet, she would have to stop her diabetes meds. And then when she got back to New York, to Manhattan, she would have to start them up again because her diabetes would come back. Just to give, so yeah, I'm, the sugar thing, I think if you're eating a crappy diet, it's probably a good thing to be leery of. If you're eating a healthy diet and you're getting, some amount of sugar, probably more than certainly I eat, it's probably going to be fine.
Yeah. When I was a vegan, so I was a raw vegan for about 7 or 8 months. I went to the dentist and they said, "You have 7 cavities." And I thought, how can I'm a raw vegan. I'm the healthiest, most spiritually refined human on the planet.
Whoa. At what point in your medical career was this?
This was actually right when I started working as a PA. I was a raw vegan for a little while.
Okay.
Yeah. And you know what? I never had any of those 7 cavities filled. And I eat more sugar now than I did as a raw vegan, but I eat meat. What did I start doing? I started eating meat again. I imagine that after 5 or 6 months on a vegan diet, I was pretty deficient in fat soluble vitamins. And of course, the dentist is saying, "Hey, let me charge you $6,000 to fill all your cavities." And I was like, "Oh no, I'm not getting these fixed. My teeth didn't fall out. Like teeth can revolve, teeth can heal from cavities."
Have you had any x-rays since then?
Yeah, I don't have any cavities anymore.
So they filled back in.
They healed. Yeah.
Yeah. Cavities can heal. I mean, it's funny when my father-in-law is a dentist, and when I told him that and told him that there were 2 separate scientists who showed that back in the 1920s and 30s, his mind was blown. It's tough because, as I said to my daughter when she called me up from Japan telling me she had a cavity, I said, "Well, if you eat the right way, you won't need to get it filled. It'll heal up just like the last one that you got." Right. So, but yeah, interesting. Interesting. So Josh, tell us about your diet transformation and how you started using it with some of your patients. Because Josh has got one of the coolest stories about a guy who was on oxygen that I've ever heard.
I had a guy with he had COPD. He was on oxygen. He had heart failure. He was a diabetic, and he just kept getting worse and worse. He'd come in and talk to me, and he'd just start like falling asleep because he had bad sleep apnea. And finally one day I just kind of told him, like, "Man, you need to just do a carnivore diet." And I was like, "Just eat nothing but meat and come back." And in a few weeks, and I can't remember how long it was, but a few months later, he walks back in. He's lost, gobs of weight. He's off the oxygen. He has these 2 bags of pills, and he just goes, "I just want you to know I stopped all these." And I was like, "Whoa, wait, whoa, what?" But it's interesting.
And to Paul, to your point about this being a ice and elimination diet, it's a super effective elimination diet, because you can tell a guy just eat meat and he'll get it.
Yeah, the guy
he doesn't even need to write that down.
But I have a lot of patients with like, symptoms of SIBO and IBS, and those are the people I try to get them to do more of the old style traditional carnivore. And as an elimination, I just challenge them like, hey, let's do 4 weeks, and then you could start adding things back in and you see what irritates your gut. And I get a lot of good results out of that. So it's been really helpful and transforming. And along the way, I've been able to get patients off a lot of medications, lose a lot of weight, and it's been amazing to see how a dietary intervention is way more effective than a pharmaceutical pill. And so,
is there a pill that you could give to somebody with COPD that would allow them to get off their oxygen?
No.
Paul's smiling too.
But yeah, it's been exciting because before 5 years ago, I would just pat myself on the back. Oh, you have diabetes. Here's a pill, and your A1C looks better, and look, your LDL looks so much better. And I thought I was being a good doctor. And now I understand why people's triglycerides are up. Why is their insulin levels high? Where's all this inflammation coming from? And the people that will listen, and you can intervene with these dietary recommendations, and you see these labs go back to normal. It's just fascinating, and and get off medications. It's extremely rewarding.
I mean, how crazy is it that you could feed someone just meat and they get healthier?
Right. Yeah.
Harvard, eat your heart out, literally, like, eat your heart out, Harvard. Like,
yeah.
No, red meat causes diabetes. Red meat is associated with diabetes. Just released on October 19th, 2023. But you feed
and
someone
one of the co-authors of that, by the way, is Frank Sachs, who's one of the premier cardiologists in the country and a big fan of seed oil consumption. He's the guy who wrote the AHA presidential advisory a few years ago saying, oh no, seed oils are great for your heart. I mean, it's hard to understand where these guys are coming from.
Can we just talk about that for a moment, Tucker? I mean, what's their argument? Like, what's the steel man here for seed oils?
The steel man. So I came across a really interesting rodent study from, I think it was the 1950s. And they were looking at how different fats induce atherosclerosis in a rodent model. And one of the oils they were using was peanut oil, right? Which has a fair amount of linoleic acid in it. And that was very effective at inducing atherosclerosis in these rodents. Then they went and they hydrogenated the peanut oil, which means they turned the omega-6 fat, linoleic acid, into stearic acid, which is a saturated fat. And that would not induce atherosclerosis, right? When they changed this omega-6 PUFA into a saturated fat, the peanut oil lost its ability to create atherosclerosis in the animals. But, and this is a huge but, if they gave them nothing but linoleic acid, pure linoleic acid, they also didn't get atherosclerosis, right? And this reminds me of a paper John Speakman, who's an obesity researcher, published a few years ago, where he looked at a wide, this like spectrum of diets, varying protein, carbohydrates, and fats. And he found that proteins and carbohydrates each have no effect on obesity in this rodent model, right? That only the fat does. But it was a curve, okay? So the rodents eating the least fat were the least fat. And in the middle, those were the fattest mice. But then as you get to a ketogenic diet, the obesity level starts going down. So there seems to be some interaction there in the middle where you're looking at this super obesogenic, and or in the case of this other rodent model with atherosclerosis, this super atherosclerotic diet, right? And I think that a lot of what these guys saw when back in the 50s and 60s, when they started recommending avoiding animal fats, was people who were eating a fair amount of animal fat, but were also getting enough linoleic acid into the diet to start stimulating obesity and atherosclerosis, right? But they misdiagnosed it, right? They never did a study saying, okay, well, let's try, one famous cardiologist, Paul White, he was Eisenhower's cardiologist after Eisenhower had a heart attack. He said, well, how can these seed oils be protective against cardiovascular disease? When I was back in medical school and was training as a cardiologist, he was one of the first cardiologists in the country, nobody had heart disease and nobody ate seed oils, right? So there's this, a lot of it's like the same mistake that they made with just fat in general and obesity, right? They looked at people eating mostly animal fat and figured, okay, that must be it, without doing the sort of elimination protocol that would have allowed them to narrow it down to the specific factor in the diet. And the problem is, once that research started coming out in the 60s originally, and then in the 90s with the Mediterranean diet, they didn't do what they could have done, which is to say, okay, we were wrong, right? Like you guys had both turned around and said, okay, I'm mistaken about this. Particularly in the case of Frank Sachs and that presidential advisory, he lied about what the data showed, and he made up a bogus criteria to eliminate diets that showed seed oils were harmful from his analysis. And then he added in other diets which were using fish, which is very cardioprotective, right? As a way of saying, oh, well, poof is good for you. Well, nobody's saying poof is not good for you. We're saying seed oils specifically are bad for you, and that's what you're telling everybody to eat, right?
What do you think was going on with the mice with the pure linoleic acid, Tucker? Does it
I
need...
don't know. I've never seen anybody replicate that except the rodent ketogenic diet. That's the primary rodent ketogenic diet is Bioserve F3666, and it's very high linoleic acid diet. And the rodents, they're a different blend. They're different rodent keto diets. Some of them do cause obesity, but it's less obesogenic than, say, a lower amount of linoleic acid and a higher amount of other fats in the diet. So this is one of the big question marks in my reading is why in Speakman's study did he see that curve of obesity, right? Where if you had very little fat, you had very little obesity. And if you had lots of fat, you had very little obesity. But in the middle, there was this really high level. Hopefully we'll get some more research in the near future that'll answer that question.
Have you seen the research on oleic acid turning on PPAR alpha, so peroxisome proliferator alpha, and then turning on delta-6 desaturase, which is an enzyme that turns linoleic acid into arachidonic acid, and then all the downstream metabolites of arachidonic acid being the oxidative products of linoleic acid metabolism, things we've talked about, the HODs and the heats and stuff. So I wonder if some amount of oleic acid is required. And I mean, we humans, and linoleic acid as itself doesn't exist in nature, right? Just like fructose.
Pure linoleic acid doesn't exist.
Pure linoleic
right,
acid doesn't exist in nature.
Just
pure
like pure fructose doesn't really exist in nature. Yeah.
With fructose, we know that you need glucose to absorb the fructose. So if you feed a human or you feed a rat pure fructose, you're going to cause dysbiosis and you're going to increase lipopolysaccharide. And so fructose looks really bad. But if you give it with glucose, different story, especially in humans. I think it's possible that, linoleic acid by itself, okay, that's something that's never going to happen in nature. But linoleic acid is it's always going to have some oleic acid. And that can certainly, and we know that interesting to me, that if you look at fats are hormonal, they're signaling molecules, and that oleic acid turns on some things in the human body, stearic acid turns on other genes. I mean, to say all calories are equal and calories in, calories out, this is ludicrous to me. Fats, more than any other macronutrient, different fats are different signaling molecules. I mean, I'm not aware of any different, maybe amylose versus amylopectin has different signaling in the human body. I guess fructose and glucose a little bit different, but like linoleic acid, 18 carbon, omega-6 polyunsaturated versus, oleic acid, 18 carbons, monounsaturated versus stearic acid, 18 carbons, 0, fully saturated. These are completely different molecules in terms of the way they affect genes. And we're talking about steroid responsive binding element proteins. We're talking about aryl hydrocarbon receptors. We're talking about delta-6 desaturase and PPAR alpha. It's crazy. And people treat these all as like, oh, 9 calories per gram. It's crazy.
Well, and they're huge. I mean, there's a lot of research going into endocannabinoids in that area. Mostly it's very recent, but there are a lot of, there's just a huge lack of interest. Everybody thinks that fat's boring, that everything we need to know about fat we learned in, we learned by 1961, and they don't want to hear anything about it, right? So oleic acid specifically, I've never seen any good evidence that absent a significant dose of linoleic acid, that oleic acid is the protective fat against obesity, right? And that protective effect against obesity is blocked by, it seems, linoleic acid in the diet. So, it's an interesting speculation about the PPAR alpha and the delta-6 dehydroxy. I can't remember exactly what it is, the D6D. And, but I haven't seen studies, all of the oleic being obesogenic studies that I've seen, all the ones in humans show it's protective. And there was one rodent model that Brad Marshall showed to me that, okay, great. But, it's kind of tough to say when you have one study sticking its thumb up and it's different from all the rest, that's the one that you have to listen to.
Yeah,
right?
it's interesting. I want to go down the rabbit hole more with Brad. I'm going to have Brad back on the podcast.
I did a debate
acid
with Brad on David Gornowski's show going over the oleic acid question. And even most of the studies, not most of the studies, I think all the studies that Brad was showing showed that oleic acid was protective against obesity in humans. So, even the guy who's promoting that idea can't come up with a good study to support it. So that's kind of an issue. And I mean, the evidence that we have is that oleic acid turns into a chemical called OEA, which is similar to the endocannabinoids. And I'm not going to mutilate the real name of that. We'll just go with the acronym from now. It's very similar to the endocannabinoids. If you make a rat obese with a high linoleic acid, high fat diet, and you give the rat OEA, it will instantly go down to a normal body weight, right? And then when you take it away, it will go back to its obese set point, right? OEA production is blocked in the body by a high fat diet. So I think although we don't know what the mechanism is, I think that it's blocked by something that linoleic acid does in the gut, right? Because that's where this process is happening. So, that is and it makes a lot of sense to get back to an evolutionary perspective. Oleic acid is one of the most common fats. It's in, tallow's a third oleic acid, lard's a lot of oleic acid, butter is a lot of oleic acid. Fat is our primary energy source, right? Most of our body energy is stored in fat. So it makes sense that when your body tastes oleic acid, it would have this overconsumption reaction to it because that's how you survive. It also makes sense that when it gets to a certain point, oleic acid produces the off switch, right? It produces the thing that turns the appetite for oleic acid off. And that's what seems to cause obesity, is blocking the production of the off switch. One of the things that causes obesity. But anyway, that's kind of off topic. Okay, well, on that note, though, let's, any closing statements you guys want to make? Josh, do you have any questions for Paul about his experience? Or
I could pick Paul's brain forever. So what is your end diet looking like now?
Yeah. So my diet is about, I would say about 40% fat by calories, about 40% carbohydrates, and 15 to 20% protein. So that carbohydrate number is much higher than it used to be. And this is interesting to me from like a hormonal perspective, from like a stress hormone perspective. Tucker and I may have different perspectives on this, but I eat fruit, I eat honey, I eat squash, and then I eat meat and organs, fresh organs, desiccated organs, like we make it hard in soil. And then I have fat that comes along with the meat. So animal sources of fat, butter, tallow, ghee, those sort of things. And that's basically my diet. So I probably get, if you break it down, I probably have about 140, 150 grams of protein a day, probably about 90 to 100 grams of fat a day. And some days, I mean, a lot of days I probably have 300 grams of carbohydrates plus a day. Yeah, from a variety of sources.
And what have you noticed? Have you noticed what body comp changes?
I feel good. So I don't get muscle cramps anymore. My sleep is better. My testosterone is now 800 again, has been for a while. Energy is good. Mental focus is good. Libido is good. No one's ever perfect. I mean, nothing's perfect, but like I feel good in the water. I don't get cramps. Yeah. And when I do my labs, my sex hormone binding globulin is now lower, which means I have more free testosterone. My fasting insulin is still 3 micro IU per ml. My A1C is around 5. So it's about the same. It's actually lower than it was on a strict carnivore diet. I think on carnivore, I had 5.4, 5.6, maybe one time. And then, yeah, I think all those things most metrics I look at are better. My LDL is now 130 to 140 milligrams per deciliter. I don't worry about LDL as a number per se necessarily. If someone has a healthy thyroid, my free T3 is better. My free T4 is higher. So my reverse T3 is lower. Yeah, most metrics and my subjective experience of life are positive with the inclusion of the carbohydrates. I don't see any negatives actually for me. Now, to be fair, this is an interesting point.
Aside from Twitter trolls.
Twitter trolls, yeah. Twitter trolls, yeah. Yeah. I think when I published my book, one Twitter troll was like, "Oh, I hope you all got your money back. This guy eats fruit and honey." So it was interesting. I just hope it benefits people. And then trying to think what else. Interestingly, when I talked to Anthony Chafee on the podcast, who people don't know, he's a carnivore doctor. He's in a neurosurgical residency in Australia. And he mentioned that some people in his experience have food addiction. And when they eat carbohydrates, it kind of triggers their food addiction, which is a separate topic. But that, I don't see any negatives to carbohydrates. That was I think his main concern, which is an interesting point. But I think that
right
in humans who,
and there's a variety of different genetic markers for carbohydrate consumption, pro and against. So it shouldn't be surprising that different people could react to carbohydrate consumption in different ways.
Yes, indeed. And I think that if people haven't eaten carbohydrates, it's notable that it takes time to reincorporate them into your physiology. Like for when I started eating carbohydrates, it took a few days. It probably took a week, before it felt normal to eat carbohydrates. The process of being in ketosis is adaptive to not having carbohydrates. And when you add them back, your body needs time to adjust to having them back. And so I think that some people try to reincorporate carbohydrates and have some experience that may be negative. But yeah, I think you also have a valid point, Tucker, that there's probably differences. I think there's a certain gene I've seen. I don't know the gene off the top of my head, but there's probably a difference in terms of carbohydrate tolerance for people. But I think that in general, I feel like,
well, just the salivary amylase gene has a huge variation in copy number between 2, which is the evolutionary level, and people who have like 16 or 32 copies of it.
Yeah. I wonder what I have.
Yeah.
I don't know how many salivary amylase genes I have. I certainly like I like squash a lot, so I like starch these days.
There you go.
Can I ask you another question? So because this is what I've been practicing or trying to do in my practice. So from like an interventional standpoint, though, let's say you have like a really, bad diabetic with, high blood sugars, would you still consider or recommend trying the original style of carnivore diet versus the way you do it now? Or do you feel like the way you do it now would be just equally as effective if they did it long term?
Now, I think that it would be equally effective long term. I think in the short term, it's beneficial to be cognizant of carbohydrate load for somebody that just doesn't handle them well. I don't believe that carbohydrates cause diabetes. I think that insulin-induced insulin resistance is pretty hard to create long-term in a human. And I think that probably all of us
in
agree
an
that,
ancestral diet, it doesn't exist.
Right.
yeah, it doesn't exist.
There's a population that was eating 94% carbohydrates in the form of
Tucasentins.
the tucasentins, and they had
Yeah.
no signs of diabetes. They weren't perfectly healthy, but diabetes and obesity were not their problems.
Yeah. So I think that there's insulin-induced insulin resistance is not the issue for humans. I think it has to do with, I mean, I've recently seen some very interesting data about proton leak at the level of the mitochondrial membrane when more polyunsaturated fatty acids, specifically linoleic acid, are incorporated into the membrane in the electron transport chain or into the cardiolipin. I mean, leaking protons across your mitochondrial membranes is a bad thing for humans and could cause some pretty major metabolic mitochondrial dysfunction. So I think there's much more compelling data for essentially seed oils with high amounts of linoleic acid leading to insulin resistance. So I don't think carbohydrates cause your diabetics insulin resistance. I do think that a manifestation of your diabetics insulin resistance is the fact that if you give them something like honey, their blood sugar could go very high, depending how much you give them. There are studies in humans where they do give them honey and their fasting blood sugar goes down. Their A1C goes up a little bit, but their fasting blood sugar goes down. So I think that, in someone that has brittle diabetes, I don't think there's a reason to give them a significant amount of carbs. I think that small amounts of carbohydrates could be beneficial for them. And small is maybe 50, 75, 100 grams a day of carbohydrates. I don't think they need much more than that. I think what I'm trying to do at that moment is minimize cortisol, minimize glucagon, minimize epinephrine, and also minimize aldosterone by giving them some salt. So like minimize those stress hormones. And I think over time, they will be able to tolerate more carbohydrates. But I think that a low carbohydrate diet is a reasonable thing for someone that's brittle diabetes. I don't think they have to go zero carb. And I think potentially lowering carbohydrates is good because they don't process them well. Like, why would you're not going to put unleaded in a diesel car. It makes sense. They don't run well on carbohydrates. Give it time. And that time could take a little while. So yeah, that would be my perspective. And you can probably play with that pretty easily and say like, okay, let's give you 50 grams of carbs a day. How do you feel? Let's give you 75. Oh, okay. Maybe that was too much, or 100, or maybe you feel a little better on 100. Maybe there's some wiggle room in there.
Yeah. And that's definitely how I've kind of evolved the way I work with patients now. Cause initially I used to, try and do a strict ketogenic diet. But my goal for my patients is to, reverse that fatty liver disease, get the insulin levels down, get the labs back to normal. And then I do start incorporating clean carbs back in. And I've noticed that has been fine for a lot of my patients. Whereas, 3 years ago, I thought I'm just never going to eat a carb again because I'm 3 years in on keto, and then all of a sudden I get sick, I lose all my muscle and I have to kind of reevaluate things. So I had a similar experience with my overall health after a long-term ketogenic diet. So
how many carbohydrates are you eating these days, Tucker?
I don't keep track of things to the extent that you do, and I commend you for doing it. I tried doing that once for a single day, and it was a horrible experience. And I swore never to do it again. But I like to think of what I'm doing as intermittent ketosis.
Okay.
Some days I'll eat, a bowl of rice or a couple of bowls of rice. We're big fans of squash. Delicata are in season right now, and they're delicious up here. And
those are super good.
I'll eat fruits and berries when they're in season a lot more. And then some days, I don't have an appetite for it, and I'll just be totally ketogenic. And to the point you both were making, when I started doing this, I noticed that adding carbs back in, I could really feel a negative effect. And it wasn't sort of anything that I could point a finger to, right? It wasn't a lab marker that was moving. I just felt like crap. But as years went by and a lot of my, it took me 4 years for my liver enzymes to go back to normal, right? So this was a long-term process for me. But now, whether or not I eat carbohydrates, it doesn't seem to make any difference to, how I subjectively feel. I don't like getting too high. I did a rice eating experiment at one point. My daughter moved to Japan and went on, started eating Japanese diet, because what else is she going to eat over there? And promptly lost weight and has been thin and lean ever since, when she was always fighting her weight over here. So that prompted me to try a rice diet. And I was like, the Japanese eat a lot less rice than we think. And I think, sort of what you're saying, a moderate, once you fix your metabolism, key point, once you fix your metabolism, a moderate amount of carbohydrate is probably perfectly healthy. That's what most people in history have been eating, is some amount of carbohydrates in the diet.
And I've done rice experiments also. But I don't personally, I think I get a headache. I don't know if it's a mold thing in the rice or what, but I don't know. I've reincorporated it recently a couple of times. I was in Australia recently checking out some regenerative farms there, and I got food poisoning, and rice sounded really good when I had food poisoning. So I had white organic rice. I'm not a fan of brown rice because of arsenic. So I ate white rice because I had food poisoning, and bring on the Twitter trolls because they're going to freak out. They're not an animal-based diet, and I thought, okay, this tasted good. I'll keep it in my diet for a little while. But I don't know, a couple of times now I've tried to reincorporate it. It just doesn't seem to agree with me, the white rice.
I can't eat it consistently. I mean, I'll have it some days and not have it other days. Potatoes, same thing. Some days, I'll have potatoes, and then someday I just don't feel the need, and I won't have any carbohydrates at all. And I feel, it's just meat and, maybe a salad and cheese, and, that feels great. I think doing regular fasted exercise is really key, right? That's what I mean by intermittent ketosis. I think getting up first thing in the morning when you haven't had anything to eat all night, and then going and doing some sort of long, reasonably intense exercise just to get the ketones flowing and to get your body kicked, to make sure that it remembers that there are two gears here, right? There's the fat gear and the carb gear, and you ought to be able to switch back and forth between the two of them without having the road bump. The same thing that I've experienced when I'm doing one or the other for a long time. It's tough to switch back and forth. And I think that flexibility is a basic human capability.
I think it is. I do the opposite. We can talk more about that another time, but I do the opposite. I get up in the morning and have a huge thing of honey and milk before I surf. For me, I just found that fasted workouts didn't feel good. When I went surfing fasted, I was colder. I didn't want to paddle as long. I feel so much better I feel so much better if I just basically, mitigate the stress hormones first thing in the morning. So all the intermittent fasters out there lose their mind when I say this, but yeah, I anti-intermittent fast. I eat all day. I stop eating a few hours before I go to sleep just because of digestion, and I can feel the difference there. But the first food that I have in the day is probably 5:20 in the morning or 5:30 in the morning. And the last food I have in the day is probably 6 o'clock at night. So but then again, that's still, that's an 11-hour window, but most people with intermittent fasting would scoff at that. And, that's what is it?
I don't intentionally try to intermittent fast. I mean, I have coffee with cream every morning. That's hardly a fast, but I found, when my wife and I started getting into backpacking, and I had started training her to go do exercise without food, there were days where we were out on backpacking trips where there was one morning we got up and we were like, we had some coffee and some cream, and we were like, do you feel like eating breakfast? No, I don't. And, we went and hiked 14 miles to like the early afternoon before either one of us felt like we were hungry and we wanted to stop for lunch. Right. And then, so I think there's a lot of trial and error and a lot of playing to figure out exactly what's going to work for each person. I think there's a basic framework, right? Avoid the junk food. Don't drink massive amounts of alcohol. Don't, smoke. But, and I would put seed oils firmly in the category of junk food. Nobody needs to be eating that in the amount we are now. But, once you're in that basic framework, then there's a lot of variation.
I think you're right. I think humans are pretty adaptable. I think we're pretty adaptable in terms of our diets, and people feel good on a lot of different things. I do think that there's value in being intentional with diet and being precise, though, kind of like we're trying to do now. and just saying, okay, yes, there's flexibility within diet to a point, but not to Oreos, not to high fructose corn syrup, not to all foods fit, which is really where this goes to. It does seem to go to an all foods fit type of position, where the other side of this perspective is people, from my perspective, people on Twitter or wherever saying, oh, what you're suggesting, Paul, is causing people to have eating disorders because you're saying that certain foods are not good for them. And I think I disagree with that. I appreciate the criticism. I'm open to the criticism, but I disagree with that. I don't think telling people oatmeal isn't great for you because it has saponins and glyphosate and heavy metals. I don't think oatmeal is a health food for humans. I don't think telling people oatmeal may not be great for their gut. And potentially, if you have gut issues, you should think about eliminating it, is causing an eating disorder. I think giving people knowledge and letting them choose and giving them this idea that, hey, not all the foods that you think of as healthy are great for all humans. I mean,
and those are, in my experience, those are the same people who are telling you seed oils are healthy, but French fries are not.
Yeah, exactly. or there's nothing wrong with seed oils other than the fact that they have a lot of calories, and fat calories will make you fat. You're going to get the same thing. That butter and seed oils are the same thing, that's important for me to push back against, because I think that
meanwhile, we learned that Darius Mozaffarian was doing research at Harvard showing that ice cream is a health food. What's ice cream? Dairy fat and sugar.
Yeah, and also, I'm gonna.
All right, Josh, do you have any more questions before we lose Paul here?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I was just going to say this, Tucker. I'm going to have Callie Means on my podcast in the future. He's had personal conversations with Darius Mozaffarian, which I'll let Callie talk about. But it was basically, like, how I need funding for my studies. Stop what you're doing, Callie. Like, stop pissing on my campfire. I need funding for my studies. It's crazy. This is why Food Compass exists. We need funding. But anyway, thanks for chatting, guys.
No, it's great. Thank you, Paul. And I hope people get, it's so funny. I've had so many people criticize me for holding the positions I hold and then not having an open mind. That's what they always say. You need an open mind. The whole reason, like both of you gentlemen, I had no interest in nutrition. The whole reason I got into this was because I had an open mind and I was open to some evidence that made me realize that what I was doing was wrong, right? And my health improved. What am I supposed to do? Ignore that, right? I mean, that's crazy. And just because I'm not willing to listen to your nonsense doesn't mean that I have an open mind. Having an open mind doesn't mean letting it fall out, right? It means being discriminating about what you're listening to and thinking and eating, right?
And eating. I think all foods do not fit. People have accused me of the same thing, Tucker, mostly in YouTube comments. Because for a while there, I think I was saying results over dogma. I think that was my clarion call when I was leaving strict carnivore diet and adding fruit and honey to my diet. And then people would criticize me in the comments and say, you say no dogma, but you're super dogmatic about vegetables. And I thought, well, there's a difference between dogmatic and actually having an intentionally held belief that once you've examined something. I don't think it's dogmatic to say that seed oils are bad for humans. When you spend time reading the research and you look at both sides and this is my decision. Right. That's not dogmatic. It's not dogmatic. I don't think it's dogmatic for me to say, I don't believe spinach is a health food for humans. I think the risks outweigh the benefits. I think it's full of oxalates. And I think that you're not going to absorb much of the beneficial compounds in spinach because of all the oxalates and other things in the compound. It's not dogmatic. It's just me saying, hey, look, this is the way I believe this. Just because what I believe is not what you believe doesn't make me dogmatic. That's crazy. So right. I think people should not fear changing their mind. And also changing your mind is okay and it's good. You don't have to be dogmatic. There's a lot of people in the health space that I think have never changed their mind. We can think of many people over the years that have they're the same as they've been 20 years ago. And I think you never change your mind on anything. Right. Okay. All right.
I'm going to pull my camera off here.
Yeah, bro.
So everybody can see this nice t-shirt that I've got. I'll pop it up on the screen because you can't really see it here. Thank you, Paul, for that.
You're welcome.
I haven't been brave enough, I'll confess, to wear that out in public yet, just because I don't know if I want some little kid next to mom to see.
Bullshit.
The idea is spot on, though. It's awesome.
Yeah. The t-shirts are, I think we actually still have the domain Kale is bullshit. I think it's kaleisbullshit.shop where all the merch is. If you want the Kale is bullshit shirt or the seed oils are bullshit shirt, it's also on my website, which is, yeah. Great.
Okay. So plug yourself. Where should people go looking for you now?
People can find me my website is paulsaladinomd.co. It's .co. And there's resources there. There's a free animal-based calculator, all kinds of stuff there that I hope helps people create a diet that works for them. That's a good place to find me.
Okay. Awesome. And you're still doing the podcast?
I still have a podcast. Yep. It's called the Paul Saladino MD podcast. That's it. And all the socials.
All you need to do is change your email address now.
I actually have changed my email address. I haven't migrated everything over to the new one. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Nice. And Josh?
Yeah. Well, I'm in the process of going into solo practice and starting.
Excellent.
Yeah. So it's exciting to take the things that I've learned from people like you and people like Paul and kind of mosh it together and come up with programs that are helping patients and get off medications. So it's really exciting. It's given me kind of life back in practicing medicine. So I'm just excited.
That's awesome.
I'm excited for you to go into private practice too, man. We need more doctors like that.
Yeah.
Well done.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you both, gentlemen. Much appreciated that you could take the time to share your experiences here today.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank
Talk to you guys soon.
See ya.
See you guys. Talk to you soon, Tucker.
Yeah.